Chag Sameach and welcome back. I want to share some thoughts on this Yizkor Day about Passover in general, but also about the state of affairs that we're in. You know that I try to be current and relevant in this difficult time, but also try to blend it in to our ancient traditions and the texts that we share. So let's start with an update from last week. On the website, I have this little thing called Perspective. And it's a perspective on cheeseburgers and cruel rabbis. About rabbis who, rather than being lenient at this time, have chosen to be strict. In other words, although there's a significant mental health crisis, how significant we'll find out in a moment, but it's significant. And amongst the Orthodox Jewish community, a community that is generally very, very engaged in socializing, there was a particular fear that, in fact, it would hit them hard. It hits everybody hard. So I was asking why the rabbis would not allow a Zoom to be set up before the holiday, just let it run so people can just look at each other and talk if they needed to. Why couldn't they have found the leniencies that exist in law? And it wasn't, as I said, because the law prohibits it, it's because their value system, whatever that is, the idea of das Torah, meaning that the scholar knows not only what's best, but knows it from the Torah and therefore can apply it to even mundane everyday life like an expert without any expertise. Fundamentally, knowledge, scholarly knowledge, gives you expertise, which is wrong. And I asked, why would they be cruel? Last week's reading was about not mixing meat and milk and cooking a baby goat in its mother's milk, the height of cruelty. And I said, don't do it. Don't be cruel to your followers. Give them every leniency possible. Was I right? Yes. 250 Orthodox Jews called the mental health hotline that was created by some really, really forward, compassionate thinking Orthodox rabbis. 250 Orthodox Jews violated their sacred principles of not using a phone on Shabbat and festivals to call because they were having a mental health crisis. 250, and that were only the people that felt permitted to do it. Who knows what's going on in a world in which rabbis are being cruel to their congregants and not allowing them the ability to do this. This is an extraordinary story. For 250 Orthodox Jews to violate their Shabbat or festival to make a phone call is a big deal. And to their credit, Amudim, the organization in New York that focuses on mental health, did the right thing. And the others did the wrong thing. It bothers me tremendously that the Talmud says, Koach de hetera adif, the power of permissiveness, of permission, is more powerful than forbidden. It's easy to say forbidden. It takes guts, leadership, strength, a deep sense of humane compassion to say yes. This was a moment for saying yes, not a moment for saying no. And talking about bad leaders, this is not about Orthodox Jewry. This is about leadership. Leadership everywhere. And the Virginia pastor who holds services, and he defies coronavirus, talks about it being a plot. It's the devil. It's something that is designed to destroy their faith. Contracts coronavirus and dies. This is a story of it's from Virginia. You can look it up. Bishop Gerald O. Glenn. And he says that I firmly believe that God is larger than this dreaded virus. You can quote me on that. He said, people are healed in his church. He was happy to be controversial and in violation of safety protocols. Friends, COVID-19 doesn't give two craps about your religious values. It only cares about your health. It attacks it, it destroys it, no matter what your leader or your pastor has told you. Stay home. They're not the boss right now. Well, that's enough of bad leaders. I do want to say that one of the primary values of Jewish life is knowing V'hadarta Pnei Zaken, and you should dignify the elderly. And I'm afraid that we have a crisis of indignity in this province and in Canada, maybe in the Western Hemisphere, where we've abandoned our seniors. Unless you have the extraordinary means and extraordinary ability to advocate for your loved ones. We see what's happening. More than half the deaths in Ontario have been at long-term care facilities. I'm sure that once this is over, we'll have a chance to look at it closely and figure out what went wrong. But what went wrong is that for an extraordinary length of time, there's been very little oversight of the industry of private health care and public. Not enough is being done to make sure that people who don't have the means or don't have the wherewithal or don't have the family advocacy are treated with the respect, dignity, and health that they require. We talked about what happens after this is over. That's one thing that has to happen when it's over. We should never live in fear that we're going to end up somewhere that's a death trap. Policies need to change. Planning needs to change. Oversight, inspection, motivation, incentives, everything needs to change. And we as a society have to demand that our most vulnerable do not have to live in the most fear. Now, let's talk about Passover. It's the 8th day of Passover. It hasn't seemed like a long Passover because days are so long already that Passover is just yet another thing that we do. But Passover is a very, very complex and beautiful and remarkable holiday, more than just the eating of matzah or the Seder. Once we got beyond the Seder, the rest of the days seem kind of ordinary. Just eat matzah, which is true. That's really your obligation, is to eat matzah on those days. That's the whole job. Eat matzah, but also remember what it's all about. And one of the things we do, of course, is we vary the readings in the synagogue, and we have a lot of interesting customs. I want to share a few of the interesting customs about Passover, and then I want to go on to one of the most difficult ones that I encountered in my own life and how I found resolution for it this year. There's a tradition around the world in which people eat they put into their charoset the dust, very little bit, but the dust of real bricks, just to remind them truly of the bricks that were made in Egypt. This is a tradition in Gibraltar. Hasidic Jews, I mentioned this earlier, pour water on the floor and dance and sing. Some have a tradition of reciting all the cities in the countries that they would have come from, that would have been in their Hasidic dynasties, parish, so to speak, their area. And they dance and they dance. Some have a tradition of dancing until the water is all evaporated from the floor. That would happen on the 7th night. To commemorate the crossing of the sea, or it might be on the evening of the 7th, to commemorate that they crossed from evening till morning to the other side. There is a tradition, some say it's Afghani, some say that it's other Jewish communities, but they have a tradition of whipping each other with bunches of scallions. And I don't mean whipping hard, but I mean the tradition of standing up and whipping because it reminds them of the slave driver's whip in Egypt. Some have a tradition, the Ethiopian Jewish community actually breaks their earthenware dishes and begins a new start with Passover. They start new dishes every Passover because they use them for Passover, then for the rest of the year, but they break them. And the matzah that they make is, interestingly enough, made from chickpea flour, and they also don't eat fermented items like yogurt and butter or cheese because it has fermentation in it, even though it doesn't have fermentation like with flour, but it's still fermented and they don't eat it. There's a tradition, a very famous tradition, it's Spanish origin, where the Seder leader goes around and taps everybody on the head and with the Seder plate once, twice, or 3 times. And I had this experience once. I had a Sephardic girlfriend and I got whacked on the head. I don't think her brother liked me a lot and just smacked me really hard. And it's really to commemorate the idea of Bibihilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim. If you saw my live Seder, you might have heard Rabbi Jared Grover talk about Bibihilu. And we were in confusion. We were in a state of utter confusion. We left Egypt. So this whacking on the head kind of scrambles your brains a bit to remind you of what's going on, where am I, that kind of thing. Some people have an interesting tradition where when they break the matzah for yachatz, the breaking the middle matzah, they actually break it into Hebrew letters. The hey or dalet or vav to make the numerical value of 10 or 5 or whatever. But it's an interesting idea that the kids can actually create Hebrew letters out of the matzah. Some people use the wine from Elijah's cup for cooking. That's a tradition. Others wear white, symbol of happiness or new start. Hungarian Jews have an interesting tradition, and I know people are going to make fun of me because I make fun of Hungarian, but the Hungarian Jews have a tradition of putting their gold and silver jewelry on the table to commemorate the fact that when they left Egypt, they left with wealth. But, I'm thinking Hungarian Jews probably are wearing most of it anyhow, so it's easy for them to put on the table. Sorry, Hungarians. I'm a Romanian, so we don't get along, Mimuna, look it up. Mimona, Mimouna. It's a great holiday and it begins tonight. You might want to participate because it's all about luck, fertility, and there's all kinds of great food, baked goods that the Sephardic Jews have and they prepare right after Chag. It's definitely a great holiday for you to get into. Mimona. So that's just a list of interesting Passover traditions you might not have encountered. But there's one that you probably have or you might be familiar with. And it's a little bit hard to pronounce. It's called gebrochts, right? It's like everybody's nightmare, gebrochts. So gebrochts is the prohibition on Passover of mixing matzah, taking matzah, and adding it to any sort of liquid or having liquid added to it because maybe there's a little bit of flour that's unbaked and you're mixing it with the matzah. And by mixing it with the matzah, you are going to reactivate that flour and turn it into chametz. If it lasts more than 18 minutes, you've essentially made dough and now you're making bread and it's a prohibition. So the word gebrocht is also the Hebrew word shiruya, which means soaked. So anything that is soaked matzah, even though according to the law, you can have wet matzah and still fulfill the obligation if it's whole. So a whole wheat matzah that gets wet will not fall apart, not immediately, certainly. So this tradition is particularly important in the Hasidic world, and I won't get into all the culinary replacements that they have, but for example, they can't use matzah meal, so they often use potato starch for everything, and that creates a whole different menu than you might be familiar with. It's considered a stringency, so which means that for 7 days of Passover, no water and matzah will touch. And if it does, I remember being at my great uncle's house and water spilled on the table, and they literally took the entire table and took everything off, every bit of matzah, everything that was there, and removed it and reset the table because matzah had touched water. Now, they don't consider that it was actually chametz, but they do consider it to be a strong tradition in which they do not mix. Well, I think you probably know by now that means there's no matzah balls. You get it? No matzah balls in the Hasidic world. You think you're becoming Hasidic? No matzah balls. And no matzah brai. Except, here's the redeeming opportunity for you. The The redeeming opportunity is that while for 7 days, people who are strict about gebrochts, or about matzah shria, about the wet matzah, on the 8th day, they allow themselves to eat it. So 7 days of restriction, 8th day free. Today, Hasidic Jews around the world can eat matzah balls. And I have to tell you that this troubled me greatly, even as a child. It really, really spoke to something bizarre about Jewish life, in which people were extraordinarily strict about some tradition or another, but then would act as though it was irrelevant one day, and it was just sort of felt like a power play. No, forbidden, forbidden, permitted, forbidden. Who decides and why? And it really troubled me. Amongst the many things that I had trouble with in trying to make sense of the consistency and inconsistency with the Orthodox upbringing, the ultra-Orthodox upbringing I had, this was one of them, and it was very difficult. So I think I came up with an answer for myself this year, and it's because of the COVID pandemic that I started to gain insight into what really is happening, why 7 days it's forbidden, and the 8th day it's permitted to eat matzah in water. So let me get back to that in a moment, the answer of why. But I have a question for everyone. What would you have done if you knew that COVID-19 was coming? What if we had warning? What if we actually knew what it would look like? What if we knew that it is going to do A, B, C, D? If you're exposed, it's 14 days before you become symptomatic, which means during the 14 days you have to be secluded, because otherwise you might be a carrier, might not even realize it. What if we knew what it would do to us? If you felt this kind of cough, you go here. If you have a fever, if you don't have a fever. What if we knew all this stuff? We're just discovering every single day. We're learning new things about this virus. Can you get it again? What does it look like on the lungs? Is it something that is preventable? Is there going to be a vaccine? Is it something that's going to be an annual pandemic? Is this going to blow on the winds across the ocean every year just like the flu? And will we be able to stop it? Or is we're just going to go through this every year, which is obviously going to change everything about who we are and how we live, if that's the case? What if we knew in advance what we know today? Right now, if we knew all the stuff, what would you have done differently? Ask yourself, what would you have done differently? You might have stocked up in your home a little bit. What would you do? There's not much you can do. Maybe you'd make sure that you had more people with you in your home so you could isolate with more people, maybe, but maybe that's not such a good thing. You'd have, I don't know, you'd pull your investments out of the market. What could you possibly have done? And I've been asking people, what would you have done? And there's not much they would have done. They would have maybe divested themselves of their car, or maybe they would have ended their lease and moved in with a friend, like that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, you're just waiting for it to happen, and you're going with the flow. And maybe, God forbid, but maybe next year, we'll have to go through the same thing, but we'll have it down to a science, hopefully. Healthcare workers work in only one environment. People wear masks, self-isolation, travelers go into mandatory quarantine. All these things will be regular behaviors. You travel through the airport, you sign a document, you're immediately quarantined, and if you don't stay there, your phone is tracking you and it's alerting the authorities. That's it. Wear a mask everywhere. That's what happens. I don't know. I can't imagine it. We're not up to there yet. But what would you have done differently? I don't know. I'm curious. Send me a note. Tell me what you would have done differently, really, in a big way. And this is how I feel about the story of Exodus. What would they have done differently? They're told to get a lamb, have a seder, dress up, eat matzah, look like they're about to leave. And then the next morning, they're still rushed. And they still have to leave in a rush. They leave in a rush so much so that they don't have time to bake their matzah. That's the story of one telling of matzah. One telling of matzah is the night before they ate it at the seder, bread of poverty. The next morning they ate it because they were in a rush. But how could they be in a rush? They knew months ago that Moses was telling them, you're going to go out of here. And then Moses said to them, go in your home, the plague will come, and then Pharaoh's going to send you. So what, they didn't believe him? The answer is maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But even though you know it is coming, it doesn't mean you can be adequately prepared. And this idea that they didn't know it was coming, they couldn't be adequately prepared, really struck a very deep chord with me. Because I think that if I were in Egypt, and this might be fantastical, but looking back sort of in the story of Exodus and how they went from being slaves to being free to being in a rush to getting to the sea to being trapped by the sea with Egypt coming across them with the desert closing in around them, they had only one choice but to walk into that water. And the story is that there was the miracle of the splitting of the sea. So what should they have learned? What should they have done differently? They obviously were not prepared to leave because then they could have baked bread and taken it out with them. So why didn't they prepare? They knew it was coming. The answer probably is because most people are show me. When I see it, I'll believe it. And once I see it, I'll figure it out. And that's really what they did. They figured it out. Matzah is a bread of figuring it out, of not being ready, of being unprepared, of maybe lacking the imagination, or maybe not worrying about it, living day to day. I don't know. Either way, they speak to many of the things we're going through now. You want to be prepared. You want to live day by day. Take it as it comes. Matzah speaks to both of that. It's the bread we ate at the Seder as a powerful indicator of our poverty and enslavement. It's also the bread that was like, hey man, I wasn't ready, but I'll figure it out. Just grateful I have something, and I'm free. So they come out of Egypt, they get to the water, and the water has to split. You might have seen the movie renditions of the splitting of the sea. There's a lot of fantastical things that happen. And there is, within the reading of the text of the crossing at the sea, also, again, just like the matzah, two versions. One version is this amazing, the water stood like giants, and some even say there were animals swimming, and others say that there were like fountains coming out and people could drink whatever they wanted from the water. Basically, if you imagine the Hollywood version of it, it's a massive walls of water on either side, and they're walking through on dry land. But if you also read the text carefully, this is a text in Exodus, you discover that there's a subtext that is often ignored because people love miracles. They love being able to use the power of God for their own purposes. So here's the subtext. The wind blew all night, and it blew a strong wind all night, and it pushed the sea off its seabed. And it was in the morning, the Israelites saw the dry land, and they crossed. The Egyptians saw the dry land, and they crossed. But at that moment, the wind stopped, the tide rose, or the water came back according to its etano, which is its usual course, that's the text, and they were drowned. Challenge yourself. Go online and look at the tide in the Bay of Fundy and how at sometimes 5 kilometers of land is visible, and at other times, with the highest tide in the world, it's all disappears. Go to most beaches, almost anywhere, there are tidal flats that you can walk out on, and needless to say, some of you might have been to Wasaga Beach, and you can walk in shallow. Now, if Wasaga Beach had a tide, that would all be completely dry. What if the story of the splitting of the sea was nothing more than a natural moment? The combination of wind and tide, there was a beach opened up where they were able to cross, but by the time Egypt got there and realized that they were escaping, the tide returned. If the Bay of Fundy is returning and you are chasing people, you will be swamped in the sea. Now, we're not trying to downplay the miracle. What I'm trying to do is ask you to read both parts of the text. Was it a miracle, or is that sort of the grandiose version of it? But was it, in fact, a natural event that occurred, and the miracle, instead of being this fantastical thing, is that it happened to our benefit. Our miracle was that when the tide returned, we had already crossed. Had it happened an hour later, had Moses asked us to get into the water an hour later, we would not have survived. We would have been swamped. It's interesting because when they get to the water, they are told, we're told in the story that they start screaming at Moses. There are not enough graves in Egypt. You took us out here. You want to kill us? This is what you want to do? Moses said, quiet. God's going to fight this war for you. And Moses turns to God and said, now what? And God says, Daber el bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel, v'yisau, and let them go. Move. Start. In other words, they had to enter the water while it was still wet, because the tide or whatever the wind did wouldn't last forever. And there's a lot of people, 1 million people to cross. That's a lot of people. So they had to start. Some people had to go in when it was high. But as they kept going, the water dissipated and dissipated and dissipated. And eventually it dried up, but then they were crossing. And when they exited, the water returned. Now, why is this important? This is important because the one thing that the Hebrews could have done when they left Egypt is they could have learned how to breathe underwater. And what I mean is, the Jewish people, if they were able to acquire one gift, it would have been the ability to breathe underwater, because that would have solved their problem. They wouldn't have had to split the sea. The Egyptians wouldn't have had to drown. They could have just been like fish, crossed over from one side to the other, and it's over. But these things don't happen. And I'm struck by this because I keep thinking, and don't tell me it hasn't happened to you. I keep thinking, what happens at the moment someone realizes they're infected? And not just infected like they might have might be slightly asymptomatic or slightly symptomatic. I'm talking about what happens the moment someone realizes they've got it, and they're going to need help. And I've been told, and I've read, and maybe you know this as well, because what COVID does is it inhibits the lungs' ability to transfer oxygen because of the liquid in the lungs. People say it feels like you're breathing in water. Try to take a breath and it feels like you're breathing in water or underwater. And I keep wondering to myself, I'm just struck by the parallels of learning to breathe underwater. And here we are learning to breathe underwater. And in our day and age, and this is the whole story of ventilators, we've created machines that can help us breathe underwater. I'm still struck every time by the people who are on the front lines putting their lives at risk. I truly am. I truly, truly am. And I don't believe that all of them need the money. And I don't believe that all of them need the job. I don't believe that all of them couldn't find something else to do. I believe there are people who genuinely see this moment as a chance to learn how to breathe underwater. So had they been able to choose one skill they could acquire before leaving Egypt, breathing underwater would have been great. And for us as well. We're learning how to breathe underwater now. Those who have COVID-19 in the worst way know it firsthand. And those of us who the rest of our lives have closed in on us like the sea, we're learning how to breathe underwater. We're swamped. We're swamped by so many little crises we can't even imagine. Many people are doing great things, but people are fundamentally shut down. Not just because socially, but also emotionally, we're shut down. We have to be. Or else we'll get sick and die. And it's challenging every aspect of who we are as people. There's a reason that domestic violence is up. There's a reason that people are now afraid to be at home but have no choice. The mental health crisis is here, and we are underwater, and we have to learn how to breathe. I want to conclude with a thought about the splitting of the sea. There's a midrash, an exegetical teaching that talks about God says that the splitting of the sea was difficult. It wasn't an easy thing. This is not an easy thing to do. Maybe not for God, but it's not easy. And there are three other things that are as difficult as splitting the sea. The first one is figuring out how to make a living. People struggle with this all the time. People end up somewhere in their lives. They don't always know where they're going. And we don't always know, will we be successful? Will we fail? And I need not tell you, there are people who are doing just fine up until now who are not doing fine anymore. And hopefully they will do fine again. But on this level, when it comes to figuring out your income and how you're going to make money, and will you be successful, and will you have enough, and will you be able to do it honestly, this is a challenge. It's one of the three things that are as difficult as splitting the sea. The other, finding the right partner. If you have not found the right partner, you know it now. These are the days that are testing like no one else. This is Big Brother for all of us. It's hard to find the right partner. And it's easy to find the right partner sometimes under certain circumstances. It's very hard to find the right partner under these circumstances. And I don't mean finding them now. That's almost impossible. What I mean is, you know that this is the test we need to figure out who we really are. I am not a pessimist. I believe that after this is over, people who have gone through this together and done the work to be compassionate and kind and open and honest with each other, maybe because they had to for the first time, or maybe because their marriage is strong, or maybe because their marriage wasn't strong, but this can be a moment in which it can be strong. And if you go through this and you are strong, even though it's as hard as God is splitting the sea to find the right partner, this is a chance for you to make yourselves the right partners. And health. The third thing that is as hard as splitting the sea is health. Understanding the whys and wherefore of the body and how it works. And it is impossible for us to know from one moment to the next. And never has it been more threatening to us to literally walk down the street, shake a hand, put your hand on a doorknob, touch something, someone walks by you, you have no idea, and 14 days later, you're dying. It is impossible to know how our bodies function and how it works. We're just grateful that we're all in good health so that we don't have to access difficult medical care at this time. It's hard to be low priority. The medical system has done a remarkable job of balancing between the two, preparing for the worst, living with a pretty good case scenario. But the vagaries of health are impossible to determine, and we must understand that these are the three things that are impossible to figure out: love, finances, and health. Those are all as difficult as the splitting of the sea. In fact, there's a rabbinic obligation, and it says, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught us, a father or a parent is obligated to circumcise his child for a boy, ulalamdo Torah, and to teach him Torah, ulahasio isha, ulalamdo umnut, v'yeshomrim af lashito b'mayim. A parent is obligated to take care of their child's early needs, to give them an education and give them a set of values that can pass on through their lives to their children, some value that anchors you as a good person in the world. To help them find a wife most likely means modeling a good relationship, but to help them work through what's important in a partner, and in fact, in those days it would have meant perhaps arranging it. But being present in your child's life, even in the questions of who they choose. To teach them how to earn a living. It's very important that a parent be responsible, whether they send them to school or they hire a teacher and they become an apprentice, whatever the case is, you're obligated to help your child. And some say you're even obligated to teach your child how to swim. So it kind of makes sense. All of them kind of make sense. But the swim thing is a little bit different. I remember my parents getting me swimming lessons. And we went to the pool. I remember I was deathly scared of water. I had this feeling that I would always drown. I always had this feeling of learning to breathe underwater, but feeling that my lungs would fill up. And I was scared. And I swam okay, and then I became less and less scared as time went on. I was more uncomfortable with the muddy bottom of the lake than I was with being in the water. Eventually, I went back and took lessons, not so long ago, and it was that one moment where I actually learned how to dive into the pool and swim, and I felt free for the first time. I learned how to breathe while swimming, and it was one of the greatest moments I could remember about water and my experience. That's what I miss terribly right now. But this idea that a parent has to teach their child how to swim is really where I want to end. Why is it that on the 8th day they are allowed to eat matzah balls? Remember I asked that question? The answer is, the Jewish people were traumatized by water. There was a trauma associated with water. Their children were drowned in the water. They get to the sea, and there they are, they're about to drown in the water. If they persisted, if the tide did not move to their benefit, they would have all been gone. There was a trauma associated with it. And to symbolize that trauma and the release of trauma, 7 days we don't eat matzah with water, but on the 8th day, once we've crossed to the other side, we're allowed to do it. I'm imagining that's a concept that can be applied to the tradition. I've never seen it anywhere. I've never heard a good explanation. I came up with this explanation because I finally realized the trauma they must have had with having to be forced into water and learning to breathe under the sea. So when we emerge from our journey under the sea here, in which breathing is so difficult on so many levels, we're going to make our way to the promised land of the new normal, of the next normal as we call it. But we're really going to renew the everyday, the boring, the banal, the basic, the unimaginative, the regular, nothing special, just the everyday things in life that we probably for a while will not take for granted until we do. But we should learn to appreciate every single breath we have, whether you're the Hebrew, the imaginary Hebrew, underwater because you have to start crossing while the water is still full, and you're holding your breath desperately waiting for the tide to exit, or you're worried about COVID-19 in which you feel like you're breathing underwater. Whatever the case is, we are in a time when one day we will be able to breathe again. And here's my final thought for today. They say that hindsight is 20/20. In other words, you can always see better behind you than before you. But I'd like to propose that hindsight is not just 20/20. The year 2020 is hindsight. We are all being given an opportunity to reflect on our past, on our history, on the moment we're in, on all the things that are important and not important. If you could, write a list of all the things you don't want to do again when this is over. And write a list of all the things you want to do when this is over. And then check yourself a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 from now. Because it will be over. And you'll have to decide Whether the new skill you've acquired of learning how to breathe underwater emboldens you, or does it just become a fearful memory that you once had? Once you learn how to breathe underwater, you should be fearless. Make that list. Figure out who you're going to be, what you're going to be, what's going to change and what's not. What are you going to rededicate yourself to, and what are you going to avoid? There's never been a better moment. We are not in control. 2020 is hindsight. Chag Sameach.